Good morning. Thank you for joining us this morning. My name is Erica Perrell, and I'm the Communications Manager with APEC. I would like to acknowledge that while we're gathering virtually this morning, we are all on lands which are traditional and unceded territory of various First Nations. APEC has actually published a number of reports on Indigenous communities and businesses in the Atlantic region. Our recent series focuses on how we can best position Indigenous communities and businesses for long-term growth. The third report in this series highlights key sector growth opportunities that have strong relevance to Indigenous communities and businesses. The economy's transition towards net zero emissions is creating many new opportunities for Indigenous participation. You can read a little bit more about this report, as well as all of our Indigenous research on our website. We're going to share a link to that work in the chat. I do have a couple of really quick notes before we get started this morning. This session is being recorded and will be available on our website by tomorrow morning. A copy of today's presentation will also be available on the event site as well. We will send you an email tomorrow morning just as a reminder that both of those items will be available, as well as an evaluation form as well for the session. As you're listening to the session this morning, if you think of any questions at any point in time, please feel free to pop them in the chat. We will do our best to answer them during the Q&A portion a little bit later on. We do have over 300 registrants this morning, so get your questions in early and we will do our best to get to them. While you're on our website looking at all that research, maybe you might want to sign up for our email updates, and you can also follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn, and links to all of that are available on the website. This is the easiest way to kind of stay up to date on our latest research and events. I would like to welcome APEC's President and CEO, David Shandy, who will host and moderate today's session. Welcome, David.
Well, thank you, Erica, and good morning, everyone. It's great to have you join us for today's webinar session. APEC is an independent, regionally focused research organization, and as part of that, we do try to focus on the bigger issues facing this region, particularly those that are coming, to help businesses and governments understand the issues that they're facing and how we can best respond. So this work that we have undertaken on the transition to net zero emissions is part of a 3-year research project. We are just completing our first year, and it's really intended to help raise awareness of this topic, to help identify the key opportunities, the key challenges, the key economic risks for this region, and to highlight some of the options and the choices that are facing us. So I would like to acknowledge all the research funders that are helping to enable us to be able to do this research. I just want to acknowledge those and thank you each one for your support. So far, we've released 4 reports on this topic, available in both English and French, freely available on our Net Zero web pages. We'll put the link to that in the chat. And these reports talk about why governments and businesses are committed to net zero, the magnitude of the objective that we're facing, and the economic risks for this region, and the policies and the tools that governments are using to try to get to that goal, and what this means for smaller businesses in particular. And that's really where we want to focus on today. What does this mean? Why does this matter for businesses, whether you're small or large? What is it that you can start doing? What is it that you need to be aware of that will affect you as we go through this transition? So we've assembled a panel of 4 speakers today who will delve into various aspects of this, the economic and policy perspective, talking to a larger business and how that then impacts their suppliers, and 2 smaller firms who can talk about what they have been doing to advance sustainability in their own operations. At the end of the remarks from our panelists, there will be time for Q&A. If you have questions at any time, you can put those in the chat, and we will do our best to respond to as many of those in the time that we have available. So with that, I'd like to now hand over to our first presenter. Lana Asaf is a senior economist with APEC. She has joined us previously, having worked in both federal and provincial governments, and she has been leading and overseeing our net zero research. So I'd like to welcome Lana to provide what we have seen so far and where this kind of really lands with businesses. Over to you, Lana.
Thank you, David, for that introduction. And thank you everyone for joining today. I'll just get started on my net zero presentation, which will kind of set the scene for the discussion to come. All right, so the government of Canada committed to reduce the country's greenhouse gas emissions to net zero by 2050. This goal is part of an international effort to limit global warming. Several provinces have committed to the 2050 target. In Atlantic Canada, this includes Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Newfoundland, and Labrador. Prince Edward Island aims to be the first province to reach net zero with a deadline of 2040. Our first report in this net zero series explained why governments and businesses are committing to the 2050 goal, and it identified important regional issues in this transition. As you can see in the graph on the screen, these goals are ambitious, considering current emission levels and recent emission reductions. Progress in decreasing emissions differs across the Atlantic provinces. The Maritimes had lower emissions in 2019 compared to 2005, while Newfoundland and Labrador had slightly higher emissions. Declining emissions partly reflect the closure of industrial plants and sites, as well as the increased use of renewable energy and greater energy efficiency. The federal government in all Atlantic provinces have climate plans containing the net zero commitment and near-term emission reduction targets. In another one of our net zero reports, we assess key government climate actions and their economic implications. We found that the plans mainly focus on actions to meet near-term goals rather than detailed measures covering the entire pathway to net zero. Atlantic businesses need clear, certain, and consistent information on climate policies and regulations. This would enable them to make timely, informed decisions that align with government net zero goals and to invest in technology that reduce their carbon footprint. But businesses shouldn't wait for more clarity from government before lowering their emissions. Pressures to focus on sustainability are coming from elsewhere, like investors and business partners. I'll address these factors a bit more in a couple slides. Part of the net zero challenge is that we don't yet have all the clean technologies needed to fully decarbonize. RBC estimates that current technology will get us about 75% of the way there. The remaining 25% will likely require significant funding from the public sector as governments need to de-risk investments in new technology to catalyze private sector adoption. Many government climate actions will broadly impact businesses, not just large emitters. Atlantic Canada has 58 large emitting facilities as of 2019. These are facilities that emit at least 10 kilotons of emissions annually. Large emitters will have to undergo significant efforts to decarbonize, and governments are implementing regulations and financial incentives to help make that happen. In our net zero report on navigating economic risks, we explain that these efforts will address about half of the region's emissions. That's why governments are also deploying measures that apply to other sources of emissions in the economy. All businesses, households, and the public sector have to take action for this net zero goal to be possible. Yet, according to a BMO survey, 76% of Canada's small to medium-sized enterprises don't have a climate plan. The survey shows that the high cost of mitigation actions are impeding the creation of these plans. But businesses will also incur costs if they don't lower their emissions. Certain federal measures are making it more expensive for anyone to emit or use fossil fuels. So let's take a look at a few of those measures now. The fuel charge, commonly known as the carbon tax, is a federal charge applied to fossil fuels like gasoline and home heating oil. The charge varies depending on carbon content of the fuel, and it increases annually until 2030. For example, the charge on gas will go up from 14 cents a liter in 2023 to 37 cents a liter in 2030. The fuel charge for diesel is 17 cents a liter in 2023 and 45 cents a liter in 2030. The federal government hasn't stated what prices will be past 2030. An action that works alongside the federal fuel charge is the federal clean fuel regulations. These regulations apply to fuel suppliers. They require them to make gas and diesel cleaner during the transition to more widespread electric vehicles. Suppliers will likely pass on at least some of their added costs to customers, contingent on approval from provincial regulatory bodies. As a result, the government estimates that the clean fuel regulations could add up to 13 cents a liter to gas and 16 cents a liter to diesel by 2030. The proposed clean electricity regulations will require electrical utilities to transition to a net zero grid by 2035. As part of this initiative, the government is mandating the phase out of coal power plants by 2030. Nova Scotia and New Brunswick are working towards this deadline. These regulations will likely lead to higher electricity prices as utility companies heavily invest in reducing their emissions. The federal government is also finalizing the Canada Green Building Strategy. It will contain actions to make old and new buildings net zero. Many businesses could face higher rents as building owners invest in retrofitting and new builds are net zero. However, businesses may also receive some savings as these buildings do have higher energy efficiency. Government regulation isn't the only reason why businesses are investing to reduce emissions or improve their energy efficiency. Our net zero report on green business investments uncovered that companies are facing greater pressure to focus on sustainability from investors, regulators, employees, customers, and their business partners. There are also many other factors that may lead a business to adopt clean technology. The chart here shows the main drivers of clean tech adoption by Canadian businesses in 2019. Businesses most often reported corporate policy as a key driver for clean tech purchases that year. Regulatory requirements were a close second. Atlantic businesses we recently interviewed said that at present, there isn't always a sufficient return on investment for clean technology adoption. The return on investment will likely go up alongside increasing government climate actions, increasing market pressures, and technology improvements. For example, the government continually strengthening the fuel charge and clean fuel regulations will make investments that reduce energy more attractive. Government incentives also help improve the economics of investing in clean technology, like rebates for electric vehicles or heat pumps. These supports can be a great way to encourage more timely adoption and can be carefully rolled back as rates of return increase due to those forces I just mentioned. Most organizations need to think about reducing emissions from transportation and buildings. Others will have to consider how to reduce emissions in their production processes. Some businesses we spoke to for our research told us that they don't know how to reduce their emissions footprint, what steps they should take, and what options are available to them. We created a 3-step process to help businesses understand how to move forward. This framework can be found in our report on green business investments, where we also provide examples and resources that correspond to each step. The initial action is to measure the organization's level of emissions and assess sources of energy use. This will identify where improvements can be made in terms of lowering emissions. Greenhouse gas inventories and energy audits are 2 tools that can help with measurement. The second action is to determine whether any operational changes could be effective, low-cost ways to decrease emissions. These changes do not involve capital spending, but they could affect operating expenses. Businesses may hire a consultant to recommend changes and help implement new processes. For some businesses, that may be all they need to do. For many others, though, they'll need to consider clean technology investments. Capital investments in clean technology usually take more time and money to implement than operational changes, but they can result in significant emissions reduction. Energy efficiency upgrades should be the first thing to consider for most organizations that own or can make changes to their building. These upgrades use off-the-shelf technologies with a lot of financial incentives available. Other invest methods we describe in the report include things like electric vehicles, industrial equipment upgrades, and renewable energy generation. We're clearly on a big journey that's going to change the way we live, consume, and produce in less than 30 years. Governments must stay focused on facilitating this transition to make it as smooth as possible. Businesses should consider reaching out to their industry associations to better understand the key risks and opportunities for their firms. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Lana, for that great introduction as to why we have these goals and some of the opportunities, especially for our smaller firms, to be able to understand what steps they can begin to take. And we'll unpack that as we continue with our panelists So now I'd like to introduce Andrew Willett. He has worked in the Woodlands division of JD Irving Limited for almost 25 years. He is now the Director of Sustainability and Indigenous Relations with JD Irving Limited. And he's going to provide that bigger manufacturing perspective, but also then how that impacts their sustainability throughout their supply chain. Over to you, Andrew.
Thank you, David. Just trying to turn the video on here. So I'll get started. Maybe someone can turn my video on for me. Thanks, and I hope to support some of the things that Lana talked about in her presentation. I'm not going to talk about about JD Irving Limited as a whole, all 19,000 employees in our various businesses. I'd really like to focus our conversation on what we refer to as our forest supply chain. So our forest supply chain is about 5,500 employees across Canada and the United States. We really think about our supply chain as seed to shelf. And I want to focus on the supply chain, the forest supply chain, because this is where we get the most demands from stakeholders for information and where we have the biggest environmental footprint. Our forest supply chain, as I said, is sort of seed to shelf, and it starts with our timberlands, whether it's our private timberlands or the timberlands that we manage on behalf of the Crown over the long term. Over the short term, we use those timberlands to harvest wood and supply our downstream operations. Obviously, it goes to sawmills to create lumber, but then also some of the byproducts from the lumber business, we can continually add value to them, whether it's making wood pellets or wood chips that come to St. John and make pulp and paper. And then downstream from the pulp business, we can add value in the tissue business. And we have tissue operations in Dieppe, in Toronto, in Fort Edward, New York, and in Macon, Georgia. So I'm going to focus the conversation here on the impacts to the forest supply chain. Next slide, please. And this supply chain has pretty significant challenges. We are a large manufacturer, and therefore we're a large consumer of energy. We use a lot of fossil fuels. We use a lot of electricity. And so the cost of energy with climate policy and electricity policy is going to have a significant impact on the cost of our business. As well, most of our products leave Atlantic Canada. We're a big exporter. So we're exposed to things related to transportation, like the Clean Fuel Standard and fuel taxes on fuel. And as an exporter, it makes it very challenging because our competitors in the United States don't have these sorts of taxes. It makes it very challenging to pass some of these additional costs onto our end use consumers. And then our raw material is biological, right? It comes in the forest and we're exposed to climate change. The tree we plant today is going to be cut down in a very different environment 40 years from now. And so there are risks associated with the climate that we need to understand. In addition to that, there are opportunities. We see an opportunity for more green building materials, more green packaging, and I think there's going to be an opportunity for more green energy. So our approach to these challenges are really twofold, and I would say we're fairly early in our journey here. But the first and most important is to understand what our carbon footprint is. We need to understand it in detail, so then we can take actions to address how can we reduce it. And then second, and I'll talk about this in the later half, is when we communicate it, we need to be very conscious of how we communicate it to maintain trust and credibility and avoid greenwashing. So I want to show you in the next slide, please, our carbon footprint. And I don't expect you to dig into too much here on the slide, on the figure on the slide to the left, except to show that understanding your carbon footprint is quite complicated. It can be quite complicated for a supply chain that's as long as ours, from seed all the way to shelf. And we've really characterized our carbon footprint in three broad categories. Scope 1 is all the fossil fuels that Irving uses. So think about it as the natural gas in the paper business, the gasoline in company vehicles. It's about 22% of our footprint. We use a lot of electricity, and so Scope 2 emissions are the emissions that come from electricity. What really matters there is where does your electricity come from and how is it generated? And in New Brunswick, we've got Beldoon, which is coal. We've got Coulson Cove, which is oil. Similarly, in Nova Scotia, our operations there, a lot of the electricity comes from coal. So while we're big electricity users, we also are operating in jurisdictions where the electricity is rather dirty. Probably the most challenging thing to account for is what's called Scope 3 emissions, which is your upstream and your downstream supply chain. And in our business, those could be things like the logs we buy from our contractors, the packaging we buy in the consumer products business, the chemicals in the pulp and paper business. But our biggest Scope 3 emission is really the freight to our customers. And so we've counted these emissions right until we transfer ownership, till we transfer ownership to a third party. Again, about 2 million tons across the supply chain. Next slide, please. So the emissions aren't the only aspect of our forest supply chain. And while we're a big emitter, while we emit about 2 million tons of emissions across Scope 1, 2, and 3, on our private forest lands, because we're growing more than we harvest, we also remove about 2.5 million tons of carbon in 2021. And when you cut a tree down and manufacture it and turn it into a building product, you transfer that carbon from the atmosphere and store it into a house over the long term. So while we emitted 2 million tons, our supply chain actually removed 1.5 times more than we emitted, and we could be considered to be carbon neutral. So I'm not going to talk a lot more about the removals in this presentation, but I think it's a real opportunity for us to think about not only how do we reduce emissions, but how do we make investments that can increase removals. Next, please. This is sort of related to the concept of greenwashing, and I think we need to be really careful about how we talk about our net zero goals, because decarbonization is going to be very difficult. And I want to give a few examples of why decarbonization will be difficult from our own supply chain emissions. So it should be no real surprise as an exporter, most of what we make leaves Atlantic Canada, and it leaves on a truck, it leaves on a rail car, it leaves on a ship, and all of those modes of transportation rely heavily on diesel. And so our biggest emission across the supply chain is freight to our customers, internal and external. And until there is a replacement for diesel at scale, it's going to be very hard to think about how we decarbonize our supply chain. Second, our second biggest emission is the emissions that come from electricity at Irving Paper here in St. John. And well, not only is Irving Paper a large consumer of electricity, because that electricity in New Brunswick comes from places like Beldoon and Coulson Cove. Until the utility makes investments to reduce their emissions, there's really not much that we can do there. Perhaps more concerning than that even is, what is the cost of that replacement power going to be? As Elena alluded, the cost of that greener electricity is likely to be higher. And so if the electricity grid does get greener, how do we maintain a competitive business with higher electricity costs? Our third biggest emission is natural gas in the tissue business. And if you don't know a lot about the paper business, we're basically taking 1% wood fiber and mixing it with 99% water and then forming a paper sheet. And then you spend the rest of the process with heat and energy to drive that water out. And so natural gas is how we do that mostly in the paper business. And until there's a replacement for natural gas at scale, it makes it very challenging to think about how we could decarbonize our supply chain. I won't talk a lot about this, our next biggest emission, which if you're using fossil fuels, you have to account as part of the standard for how those fuels get to your facilities. But I will talk more about capital expenditures. You know, capital expenditures are a good thing. It means we're investing in the business is growing. We added a pulp dryer in St. John or a tissue machine in Macon or investments in our sawmills, but those investments all require the use of concrete, use of steel, the purchase of machinery from other places. And so all that property, plant, and equipment comes with emissions. Really hard to decarbonize because we don't really know what the emissions profile is of those specific products. Next slide, please. So just to wrap up on this is how do we communicate this? How do we talk about this and maintain trust and credibility? So we think about greenwashing a lot because I think we've got a very positive story in the forest sector, but if we don't tell the story the right way, we can erode trust. So greenwashing I define as making false or misleading statements about the environmental or social benefits of your product or service. And we know that 70% of our consumers make choices based on how green or sustainable they are. So if you're making false or misleading statements, you can really get yourself offside with competition regulators, with class action lawyers in the US. So making sure that we make credible statements is really important. There is no one standard for carbon footprints or for ESG reporting, but we've done our very best to report to the sorts of internationally recognized standards that exist today, like the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. So we've made those public disclosures with ESG. We've got third-party assurance over our carbon footprint from firm like KPMG. And what I think concerns me most about greenwashing and net zero is really an aspirational target, right? In my understanding of net zero is we need to reduce emissions by 50% by 2030 and 95% by 2050. And based on the slide that I just showed previously, you can see that it's really hard to see how we are going to do that in our supply chain. So our approach to this is to really think about this from an activity basis, to think about where are our emissions, what sort of capital investments could we make to reduce those emissions, what's the return on investment on that capital, and if we can get a project approved, then how many removals are we going to get from that project? And then sort of sum up those removals. So while it might not look like a net zero commitment, I think it will have a lot more credibility, and I think it'll be a lot more real if we focus on making activity-based reductions or removals and avoid these sort of aspirational net zero statements for the time being. So that's about all I had. I'm pleased to listen to the next presenters and answer any questions in the chat later.
Great. Well, thank you, Andrew. I appreciate that. And I think in our reports, we have clearly highlighted some of those economic risks that you talked about. That's one of our key concerns as we make this transition, the need for those alternative technologies to be able to move to that. And to Lana's point, we don't yet all have the technologies we need at scale, as you mentioned. So again, there's some key risks as we move forward in this. So next, I'd like to introduce Emma Theriault. She's the VP and co-founder with DAS Concrete Countertops. She has an interesting background as a policy analyst and regional economic analyst in the federal government before launching her own company with her husband that allows her to combine her passions for both community and the environment. So Emma, why don't you tell us what you've been doing in your business?
Hi, thank you, David. So as David said, my name is Emma Theriault and I'm the co-founder of DAS Concrete Countertops. We're based in Dieppe. So I launched that alongside my husband, Yannick. We launched DAS in 2019, really with the goal of making locally made, durable and sustainable surfaces more accessible in our region in the form of concrete countertops. So DAS actually stands for, as you can see on the screen there, durability, accessibility, sustainability. So this is really the framework in which we operate. So every time we look at a new product idea or modifications to our production processes, what have you, we come back to the question, does it fit within our DAS framework? My point being here really that we've been committed to sustainability since before we founded our company. It was kind of in our DNA, our raison d'etre. And I'm going to talk about a little bit about what exactly this commitment looks like for us. So we see sustainability and reducing our environmental impact as being about more than just energy consumption, energy efficiency, operational efficiencies, because we've got that sustainable product to offer. But I'm going to start with energy, given that we're talking net zero today. So like many small young businesses, we lease our space in a larger building. So the space we took over is in an older warehouse type complex in the Dieppe Industrial Park in the Coach Atlantic building, for those of you who know that space. And it had poor lighting and poor insulation and inefficient heating. So when we walked into the space and decided this is where we wanted to be, it was sort of the first thing we said is that we need to improve this. And there's really two motivations behind that. On the one hand, good lighting and consistent temperature and humidity is very important to us in terms of producing a consistent product, being able to see well what we're doing. Concrete needs to be kept at an even temperature while it's curing, things like that. And then on the other hand, in terms of a company that's putting its stake in the ground around sustainability, just sort of doing what we can using existing technologies to improve energy efficiency was a bit of a no-brainer for us. So we were able to work with our landlord while we were negotiating our initial lease to have new heat pumps installed, to have new spray foam insulation installed, and to have LED lighting installed in that space. So the way we worked with that was our landlord paid for those costs up front and so made those improvements before we actually took over the space. and then they amortized a part of that cost across our 5-year lease agreement. So we are in effect paying for a part of those improvements, and our landlord is also covering a part of that cost, recognizing that they're coming at it with an improved space that's more marketable to new customers if we were ever to leave, and it's also lowering their own electricity bills. But as I mentioned, sort of because we offer a sustainable product, the energy efficiency of our building is sort of the first piece of the puzzle for us, but it's not the end. It's not the end game. We're also looking very much at the broader sustainability of our materials, things like where do they come from, and also our production process, how much waste we're producing, and of course the quality and the durability of our end product. One of the biggest upfront investments we made was actually in a water recycling system that allows us to clean and reuse all of our polishing water, which is important to us from a quality standpoint and a health standpoint in terms of keeping the silica dust out of the air. We also designed our production process to minimize waste, so we do things like we reuse our mold materials for making cabinets in the shop and other things. If there's any concrete left over after we poured a countertop, we are able to do things like make soap dishes or color samples or other sort of small useful objects rather than discarding that concrete. And we've also chosen a method of making concrete countertops that allows us to reduce our cement content or minimize our cement content, which is responsible for high CO2 emissions, and also maximize our reliance on local materials. So in terms of reducing the transportation impact of our materials. Lots more I could say on this, but I know my time's limited. So I just ultimately we were looking to put our money where our mouth is with respect to our sustainability commitments and narrative, recognizing that really is a big piece of our selling point or our sort of our sales pitch. So we did most of that up front. But after a couple of years, we ran into sort of two real issues just in terms of our thinking. The first was, how do we confirm for us and our customers that what we've done is as impactful as we think, or it's really the best way forward, and where do we go from here? So really we were thinking about measurement and the possibility of certifications, but measurement and certifications are very challenging for small businesses. There's cost barriers, there's time barriers, and there's knowledge barriers. And many of the mainstream sustainability focused certifications, especially in the building industry, they're prohibitively expensive, I would say, and very complicated, but important in terms of positioning ourselves for sort of future opportunities in terms of government procurement, customer demand, even government funding. So we were very excited when we heard that Green Economy Canada was looking to launch a hub in New Brunswick, and we became one of the founding members ultimately of Green Economy New Brunswick in 2021. So we've been working with them for the past almost 2 years now, I guess. So we've got an initial greenhouse gas inventory developed now, and we're sort of working with them now to do our second one and figuring out where we go from here. And I'm going to cut it here because I know my time is up, but really just to say that's sort of a challenging piece for us because we did so much up front before we started measuring our footprint that we weren't able to capture those initial investments. And now we're sort of, as we're in growth stage with sort of the limited cash flow and all of that you face as a young business is trying to grow, and leasing a space, it's sort of where do we go from here? What makes sense within our current resources and context, but still staying true to our commitment to sustainability. And I'm very happy to talk more about that in the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Emma, very much, and I appreciate your honesty there. But I appreciate the, Lana's slide talked about kind of corporate policy, and I think that's kind of what I heard from you. Like, we have this on our radar. It's very important to us even before we move into that building, and now you're trying to work through the mechanics of how you continue to roll that out through your business. So I very much appreciate that. So our final panelist for today is Ron Smith. Ron has worked in personal financial services, in regional economic development, and for the last decade, he is in his current position as manager of business development with Masstown Market. Any one of you who live in Nova Scotia or travel through Nova Scotia are probably very well aware of Masstown Market. So Ron, over to you to tell us what you've been doing in your business.
Well, thank you very much. Yes, Ron Smith, been here about 10 years, as said, for Masstown Market. Masstown Market is a family-owned business owned by the Jennings family since 1969, so we're in our 54th year. And the development here is started from the back of a half-ton truck and has evolved as part of a, belonging to the community and always trying to give the local folks what they want. So we certainly acknowledge cost of operation was one of the driving factors that has influenced a lot of our decisions along the years. We are, for all intents and purposes, a retailer of consumables, mostly food products, everything from vegetables to seafood to baked goods. Most recently, in the last few years, meat production and full-fledged dairy production, cheese, butter, all your milks, that type of thing. As such, we have always had refrigeration. We've always used a lot of energy. And yes, the cost of that has always been a concern. Some of the things that we've done in the past, very briefly, we use a lot of flour. We have a large bakery, we use a lot of flour. We have an engineered wetland to deal with those waste products. We have a full-fledged small municipal wastewater treatment system on site here to deal with the byproducts of the creamery and the butchery, for example, and our other waste products. We have always looked at any way we can to sort of save on that electrical bill from a refrigeration point of view. New compressors when they become more cost efficient. LED lights throughout most of our buildings have been incorporated. We use heat recovery from our bakery operations and our creamery butchery operations to preheat water, which we keep in storage tanks. For example, in the bakery, our water sits there at about 115 degrees all the time, just by recapturing refrigeration heat and process heat, all which comes at a cost, which I'll admit we can't quantify, but those are some of the things that we do to try and offset future costs. We've looked at a lot of things. We use a lot of packaging. We serve a lot of meals and a lot of takeout food. We look at the challenges of trying to incorporate recyclable packaging materials against the municipality, what they'll accept at the compost. We do have heat pumps in many of our buildings now, and we've gone to basically battery-operated golf carts, even some with solar capabilities, to transport goods back and forth around our site. I guess the biggest thing we've done recently is to have some solar panels erected on site. Sun-Kissed Energy is who we partnered with, and these are things we've looked at off and on. As I said, I've been here about 10 years. We've looked at composting our own vegetable and restaurant material in biodigesters. We've looked at vertical wind turbines. We've looked at 2 or 3 times now the possibility of solar panels. The solar panels, back a few years ago, we were looking at 17, 18, 19-year returns on investment before we would break even. Technology has improved. The cost of them has come down through competition, I guess, and made us look at it again. I guess we started late 2019 investigating this new process. So what we came up with is 610 solar panels over 3 phases, which spread across the year. We had approximately 277,000 watts of power being generated, which is reducing 212 tons of CO2. And what we're hoping is that it replaces about 20% of our cost, which is about $300,000 a year in electricity right now. And this should replace about 20%. Early indications are that there is a reduction. A little hard to tell in the winter, but this week, for example, we've had several days where we are actually producing more than 100% of our capacity. So in the not too distant future, we should have a much clearer image. I can't tell you that we know exactly what our starting point was, but that incremental changes along the way are what we're hoping will make a difference. And, we'd like to believe we're going to be here for another 50 years, just not me. Anyway, thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Ron, for that. It's great to see that picture with all those solar panels that maybe we don't always appreciate when we're kind of driving up to the store. This is now a time for Q&A. If you have questions for our panelists, I invite you to put those in the chat. We will try to address as many of those as we can in the time we have available. And I invite all our panelists just to turn the videos on and mute so we can jump straight in. Again, I think you've brought up a lot of issues and kind of articulated clearly some of the things we found in our research. And maybe I'll just start with our business speakers. You've all been making investments and changes, admitting, look, there's some costs here. We're not even sure what the returns are. So can you just articulate a bit more in terms of, the motivation to make some of these investments, given that maybe the economics are not as clear? And have you seen any benefits, particularly in terms of sales? Like, are you able to leverage that positioning in terms of sales in any way? Because I think a lot of the businesses we've talked to, they see the costs and maybe they see the energy savings, but they're not sure if it's going to actually increase revenues to help with that return. So any of our business speakers want to jump in on that? How do you justify making some of these investments, given that you're not sure about the full financial returns, and any returns you have seen in terms of sales that you can kind of measure or articulate?
I can jump in. So I think really the for us, if we're not making these sustainability investments, we don't have a product. Based on, so people come to us really for two reasons. One, they're looking for a sustainable product that's locally made, or they're looking for something that's different. And so that sort of sustainable, locally made piece is huge for us, and being able to talk to them about waste reduction, the fact that we don't have all of the kind of the cutoffs that you see in the granite and quartz industries that are piling up in mountains and people don't know what to do with them. The fact that we're sourcing our materials locally, all of those things. The other piece, I guess, for our product is really the ease of repair and that sort of resilience and the ability to extend the life of the product. That resonates with our customers, and I think if we didn't have that, like I say, we wouldn't have anything to sell. In terms of and for us, sort of the motivation to make further investments is really just continuing to support that commitment. I guess we're not at the point of looking at solar panels and major things. If we get into the point of having our own building, that's a whole different conversation. Then we'll be looking more at ROI. For now, it's just sort of what can we do within our resources that allows us to keep moving forward.
Great. Ron, did you want to add anything from your perspective?
Sure. I mean, we're fortunate that we can look year after year and see that sales here increase a little bit year over year. We've been well known for many years for supporting local farmers, local beef, local pork. Those are kind of the reasons that people come here. And it's always been a belief that you have your customer leave with a little more than they expected. Well, they don't come here probably because they know we have solar panels now, but they can't help. But when they get here, they see them. So they're pleased to come for an ice cream we made on site, or a glass of chocolate milk we made right here, or go down the road and pat the cow. Then when they turn around and they see the abundance of solar and they start to ask questions, even if we're not the most gifted at having all the technological speak to tell them, we can inform them about what we're seeing on our power bill. And it just cements a little further that, yes, our business is local, it's here to stay, and investing in the future. And they do seem to appreciate it. And very quickly, we donated some space for the flow charging stations. And I'm told that now we are the busiest flow charging station. There's 2 of them here on site in the province, I think. So people do stop by. They are using electric cars more and more. And so, yeah, that's what we're seeing from it.
Oh, that's great. So Andrew, I know you may want to add to that question, but I know I was kind of struck by kind of your presentation and kind of thinking about, well, what can your suppliers do, the people in your supply chain, if the main thing that they're contributing is the diesel of the rail or the truck? Like what specifically could your people in your supply chain do? Like, because we know in certain markets and government increasing environmental standards in procurement, and so that is certainly a concern if you're a small supplier that you may be shut out. And I think some of our other businesses kind of alluded to that. So is there anything right now, until an alternative to diesel comes, that some of your suppliers can actually be taking steps to support kind of your reporting in emissions, but also kind of the greater goal? I don't know if you can kind of speak to that aspect.
Certainly the big step change comes when technology replaces diesel. But in the short term, I think there's lots of opportunities to improve productivity and lots of opportunities to improve efficiency. There's some things that we've been doing in the Woodlands division to increase the capacity of trucks. You can add axles to trucks and increase the payload on trucks, and it's an automatic 15% improvement in productivity. It's an automatic 15% reduction in the fuel per ton. So I think there's a lot of opportunity around efficiency that we should focus on now as we wait for the step change to come in technology. And then, over the past, since 2007, we've made lots of investments in fuel switching to use more biomass fuels. And I think locally, where we're close to the forest, there's more opportunity to use those to offset natural gas or bunker C oil, or even make electricity from waste steam. So I think there's more opportunity for that to continue as well.
And in terms of your suppliers, you talked about efficiency and productivity improvements. Are you working directly with some of your partners in your supply chain, either to educate or incent or encourage them? Is that kind of are they coming to you? Or are you going to them? Like, how is that dynamic working within your supply chain?
We're certainly working together with our partners to identify these sorts of opportunities, to help the financing of those sorts of opportunities, and really encourage them. Efficiency and productivity is going to help everybody succeed. So
that's great. So Lana, you talked about some of the motivations to investments. You've also kind of talked about some of the barriers, like, what are the key barriers and what's the role here for governments? Because I think all our panelists have talked about, look, this is challenging. There's cost, we don't have the expertise, there's information barriers. Like, what are the barriers that the research would indicate? So where do you see governments being able to help address some of those to make it easier for businesses and other people to move forward?
Yeah, I think all the speakers really addressed those key concerns that we've been seeing in surveys and hearing from interviews with businesses in terms of barriers like insufficient return on investment. There's competing capital priorities, especially when you might be a little bit strapped for cash flow as a smaller business. Also, the lack of time to just learn more about net zero, what you can do. So lack of time, lack of knowledge. And something too in our interviews that really came through with Atlantic businesses is that there is a lack of workers to support building retrofits and clean technology adoption locally. So we need to focus on developing the supply chain regionally in order to kind of move forward on some of these net zero actions. So in our business investments report, we talk about how removing some of these barriers or mitigating them will require like a multi-pronged approach between governments, industry associations, businesses, educational institutions. But in particular, there are some strong recommendations for governments. So they can help facilitate this transition by, first of all, just raising awareness about the net zero commitments and the different actions that governments are implementing that will affect the business community. Also, too, another key one is when they're reviewing financial supports or incentives to help move along some of these initiatives, that they do that with a SME lens to ensure that they can access this funding appropriately, and so that they also do that when they're developing new financial supports. And then also to work with educational institutions to support skills development so we ensure that we have the labor we need for a net zero economy.
That's great. So again, just to remind you that the chat might have been turned off accidentally earlier on, but we are now seeing those questions in the chat. So if you were trying to put a question in earlier, I'd encourage you to put that in right now. One of the questions is about kind of what would you like to see from government? So I'd like to get your perspective in terms of kind of where you're going next. What would most help, beyond technology to help with diesel, like what would most help your business move forward on this agenda, whether it's federal, provincial? What can governments or other organizations do that would help you? Andrew, I don't know if you want to take a first stab at that.
Well, I think in the last budget certainly did help. There's a lot of incentives for green energy. One of the things we think could be added or enhanced there is more recognition of the benefits of bioenergy and more opportunities to help us invest in that. I think that's a good transition fuel. I think that's a sustainable fuel, and more support for biomass would be helpful.
Emma, what about you? What would most help you as you try to move forward in terms of your business?
I think flexibility, really. So I guess there's, like I talked about certifications as the cost of getting some of those certifications, and even just understanding which certifications make sense for our business. That's one piece of it for us for sure. Also just sort of, I guess, flexible support in terms of making improvements step by step in sort of small incremental improvements. I find a lot of the programs that are out there right now, they're either they're willing to fund a consultant, but maybe not the actual upfront, the capital costs associated with whatever the consultant says you should do. So that's a hard piece for us. Often we know what we need to do, we just don't have the capital to do it. The other piece is a lot of the programs out there, they are large amounts. Like you need a project that's 100,000 or 200,000. Sometimes we could do a step change with $2,000 or $3,000 of funding, but it's too small for the programs to look at. So I think more flexibility in that sense, and just sort of working with individual businesses. This is what I want to do. How can you help me do it on a smaller scale often?
And I think that's a valid point, just in terms of kind of what we were talking about in line, is like there's the easy steps, there's the low cost ones before you get into the bigger ones. So if you can help incent businesses take those first steps, that might help them in that bigger decision. Ron, what about you? What do you think from your perspective would help you as a business that governments could do differently than what they're currently doing that would help you make further investments or changes in the sustainability direction?
I think we've seen some move in the right direction. Traditionally, as I said, we're predominantly a retail and automatically disqualified from any government programs based on being in the retail sector. So now some of these energy projects, rebates on heat pumps and things like that, at a residential level at least, they're not looking at a specific sector. That's very important. And the other thing that is very important is for ease of application and ease of getting your money back. As stated, some of these projects could be 5,000, 10,000. Many of them are under 100,000. To have to take days or weeks or hire someone to complete an application and an auditor almost to verify that you spent the money properly on such small amounts really discourages a lot of small businesses from taking the time. So that's where I would concentrate.
So we've talked a lot about kind of customers and kind of wanting to see this and wanting to see that a business is kind of going green and improving their sustainability. A question has come out more about the talent side. As you've made these investments and changes, as you're positioning your business, are you seeing any benefit in terms of everyone's struggling to get workers or retain workers, or in terms of attracting and retaining, in terms of kind of workers more pleased that I'm now working for businesses that is making these types of things? Can you speak to the talent side of this, kind of going green and being more sustainable? I don't know who wants to jump in on it first.
Yeah, I'll jump in there. It's critical. I think millennials, maybe it's not even just millennials. Yeah, many people want to work somewhere with a purpose. And if you can explain to them your purpose, and your purpose is around sustainability, and it's credible, right? I think it's going to be key to attracting people to come to both to the region and to our sector. And we're starting to see that with people that we're talking to, people that we're recruiting. They've read our ESG report. They have, in some cases, applied because of it. So I think communicating these sorts of messages is absolutely critical to attracting workers to workforce.
Great. So Ron or Emma, any comments at the smaller business scale?
We certainly are fortunate to have some key individuals in key areas such as dairy production, bakery. I wouldn't like to pretend that we have people that came here because we've made an investment, but we have some very long-term employees here, some that exceed 30 years. So I think the package says, combined, we're doing something that they appreciate, and they certainly notice the investment in the solar panels, for example. You can't miss that one.
No, exactly.
I would say we're kind of coming at it we've had the opposite experience as like our employees are really it's a labor role. And we find that the trades are a little slow. Like I'm on the board of the construction association as well on the commercial side. And it's like, they're just starting to talk about this stuff. And so getting our employees to care is the harder piece, and bringing them on board with this narrative. Things like, they're at, why am I bothering to clean this piece of melamine, which we could throw in the bin that we plan to reuse, or why am I taking the time? So there's extra steps that are involved in our waste reduction, which we've had a hard time getting them to care. And I think that's our experience to date. We thought it would be, we thought our customers would be more the millennials, and we're finding they're actually the older people who have lived with different materials and appreciate the value of being able to repair things more. And so it's interesting. It's not what we were expecting going into this.
Right. No, that's great. So I think we've seen from all of you kind of on the business side, kind of your commitment to this. Questions come in that as certain governments are working with kind of other companies to discuss making some of the changes, for example, that you guys have made, they're not necessarily fully engaged. And I think, Emma, you've talked about it even, in terms of employees, they're not yet seeing that. So as business leaders, what do you think governments can do to help other business leaders? Like you're clearly engaged on this, but not every business is maybe in the same place that you are. So any thoughts or ideas about how can governments or other organizations work with businesses to help them, or employees, to help them kind of see kind of where we're going and why this is important and why their business needs to look at that? Any thoughts from a business perspective about how they can better encourage other businesses to start looking at some of the steps that you've taken?
I'll, if you don't mind,
Yeah, go ahead, Ron.
I'm kind of a broken record in the area on this one. Every time a small business enters into a project, you have to go out and hire an engineer, you have to hire a designer, you have to hire anything from road construction, doesn't matter. And then you take it to government and they employ someone to review what you paid for and then send them away to redo them. I think if government could use some of their experts to perform some of those tasks for small business, to remove the uncertainty and the cost, they'd be far more eager to enter into projects, some of which would be conversion of energy types, for example, rather than having to go out and hire their own supposed experts. So.
That was a great point. Emma, were you going to jump into?
Yeah, I think the way that the government talks about the green economy could change a little bit. When we talk about green economy, we often the government jumps to $1 million clean tech projects. And I really think they need to start talking about sort of the green economy being the economy, and looking at sort of not dividing it into two pieces, but actually sort of looking at support, like coming back to those sort of support for small projects, helping the bakers and the hairdressers and those small community businesses to make those improvements. And I think the more we do that, even if like what I've always found, the little steps, they don't feel very significant, but they help change your mindset. Like I've made one step towards being green. What else can I do? And sort of celebrating that and rewarding that and supporting that. And I think like those little steps may not be hugely impactful, but they're impactful in the way that they change our mindset, and then they change the story that the companies are giving to their customers, which then change. It's a bit of a domino effect. So that's what I would like to see a more inclusive green economy discussion.
Andrew, did you want to add anything to that?
I don't think I have a lot to add. I think that it sounds to me like the support's really needed for the small and medium-sized enterprises, and anything the government or other businesses can do to support them would be helpful.
So Lana, final opportunity to comment from you either on this question or other final advice for businesses or governments in this area?
Yeah, I guess I could just add that some of the businesses we talked to for the business investment report too, they acknowledge some of the other benefits that came along with taking on some of these investments, whether it be increased productivity, cost reductions. So those are some of the things too that I know it would be on a case-by-case basis, but if governments can look into that and emphasize those benefits as well, it might kind of make them more on board for some of these initiatives.
That's great. Well, I'd like to thank Ron, Emma, Andrew, and Lana for joining us today, for sharing your insights, perspectives, and experiences. I'd like to thank all of you for joining us today, for being part of this. We certainly encourage you to share the recording with your team, other people in your networks. Again, I would like to thank all the funders that have made this research possible. We will be putting a evaluation form in the chat. I would encourage you to just take 30 seconds to give your feedback. We will be emailing that out to you as well when we send you the recording. So I encourage you to take a few minutes to that. But that does now conclude our webinar. Thank you very much for taking your time this morning. You can grab the link before you exit to that evaluation form, or do it when you get the email tomorrow. But thank you all for attending today, and thank you all for a great discussion. Very much appreciate it.